As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace.
On October 15th, 1894, our oldest child, Sadie, who had been like a second mother to her brothers and sisters, got married. The man she married, George Neely, worked for me in the blacksmith shop. He was a widower with 2 children that he had with his first wife, Musie and Ernest. George Neely was twice our daughter's age. I know, now, that affected my wife, Mary, who gave her consent rather unwillingly. To me, he seemed a very nice man. I consider myself a pretty good judge of people, and so they were married. The next year, my wife and daughter, Sadie, both gave birth to baby girls. My daughter's baby, little Mary Edith, was born July 29th, 1895, but died less than 3 months of age. Our little daughter, Mary Ethel, was born March 22nd, 1895. But she too died in infancy at only 4 months. There was great mourning at our house that year. Both little coffins were buried in the Patterson Cemetery. George was a first-rate blacksmith. He had gotten an offer that was too good to turn down. So, in 1896, Sadie and George pulled up the stakes and moved away from us to Crawford, Missouri, where George had been raised. George's daughter Musie and his son Ernest spent more time with relatives than they did with George and Sadie. One or another of them came to our house often for an extended visit. They would call Mary and I Ma and Pa. We were family to them, as much as anyone, I expect. Sometimes they would stay with an uncle in St. Louis for a period of time, or they would stay with their grandparents, Rainey Harrisons, who lived near Patterson. In other words, Musie and Ernest were footloose and fancy-free youngsters. I'm sure Sadie was perfectly willing to have them at the house, but I suppose they got used to being passed around between relatives before George and Sadie married. George and Sadie did have another little baby girl on August 9th. They named her Lenore Elizabeth.
And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel to the whole creation."
There were 2 Presbyterian churches in Patterson, Old School and Cumberland. The Old School Presbyterian is the one that my family attended. They also allowed a Baptist minister to preach there once a month, and several people were of that faith. We did not belong to either of these churches, even though I served as Sunday school superintendent for several years. In later years, those 2 churches merged, and the old Cumberland church was torn down and sold. My heart belonged to the Christian church, having been converted to that faith at Marine, Illinois, where Mary and I both attended in the early parts of our lives. The closest Christian church was all the way out in Piedmont, or Greenville at that time. Around 1895, I felt the call to preach. My wife, Mary, was dumbfounded. I was ordained as an elder at a small town called Peachtree Fork in December 1895. At a neighborhood schoolhouse where a meeting was in progress, we organized a church. As they needed a regular pastor, I took over this church and would ride from Patterson on my horse on Saturday afternoon and preach on Saturday evening, Sunday morning, and Sunday evening. In just a few years, I had organized churches at many country schoolhouses. I served regularly at Brunot, Peachtree, Camp Creek, and King's School, one Sunday a month. I never received payment for this, but only asked for free will offerings. When Estella was about 8 years old, I took her with me on my beloved horse, Old Bald, to Peachtree Fork. There was a convention of ministers there. In those days, it was a great honor to entertain the preachers and their families, so we always had more invitations than we could fill. One place we stayed, there was a little crippled boy of about 13 years old. He had what they called white swelling in his leg. He walked with crutches then. As Estella was playing with the little boy, he would continually tease her to sing for him. And so she did a few times. I suppose he had heard her sing in church. Years later, this lad became Estella's husband. I have to admit, I was strong in my belief. I spared no one of preaching the truth, even if it meant stepping on toes.
But the lamp of the body is the eye. Therefore, if your eye shall be sound, your whole body also will be illuminated.
July 30th, 1898 was a hot day when Dr. Sebastian brought my son Frederick Edwin into the world. He was the 12th child in our family. Mary said, "I always wanted to name one of the boys Fred, and I had to wait till my 12th child. His name shall be Fred." Freddie, as we called him, grew like a weed. I remember carrying him around. He was so heavy. We all had to help take care of him as Mother and Ruth had much to do with cooking and washing. When Fred was a year old, I developed granulated sores on my eyes. They were red and inflamed. I finally decided to go see my doctor in St. Louis to see what could be done. Mary and I took Fred so Mary could take care of him. We were gone about 3 weeks. We left William and Ruth to take care of the rest of the family. The doctor had bad news. I couldn't work over the forge in the blacksmith shop anymore, as the intense heat would make my eyes worse. My condition had been caused by bending over the forge, the never-ending heating of shoes for horses and tires for wagon wheels. This was a great misgiving and broke my heart. I knew that I would have to leave our comfortable home and move out in the country where I would have to try farming again.
A glad heart makes a cheerful face, but a sorrowful heart, the spirit is crushed. The heart of him who has understanding seeks knowledge, but the mouths of fools feed on folly.
I often stayed with the Kimmels when I preached at the Kimmel Schoolhouse. In 1900, Mr. Kimmel told me that he was preparing to move the family to Kansas. Because I could not work at the blacksmith shop and was looking to do some farming, I traded a team of young mules and a new wagon to Mr. Kimmel for a 160-acre hill farm 6 miles north of Patterson. The farm was in an out-of-the-way neighborhood called Upper Camp Creek that was mostly wild timberland lying between two hills and crisscrossed by a beautiful little stream. With all those natural resources and the help of a few good old horses and mules, this farm could produce what we needed to support my family of 7 growing children. It had a very good 4-room frame house, but not half large enough for my family. I didn't want to sell the home or shop in Patterson, so it was decided that my eldest son, William, and Ruth would stay there. William was to run the blacksmith shop, and Ruth to keep the house. A young fellow by the name of Dick Croy was to work in the shop with William. In January 1901, Dick Croy bought a half interest in the tools and materials in the shop. He boarded with them until Dick Croy married Miss Sally Williams of Piedmont 3 years later. This left us with 6 of the children: Eli, the oldest, Estella, Virgie, Millard, Charles, and Fred, who was just 2.5 years old. How well I remember our first night on the farm. Everything was so strange and smelled funny, and it was so dark with only one house near enough to be seen and timber on all 3 sides. My daughter, Virgie, couldn't talk very plain, and she would say over and over,
"Ma, let's go home. I don't like this old place."
The house was literally alive with bedbugs. We scalded all the walls by pouring hot, scalding water with carbolic acid on it. My wife Mary would cry as she and the kids worked. We thought we had all of them, but they still got in our beds. So Mary made pallets for the kids to sleep on, but the pests would crawl out on the rafters and fall down on us. I was finally able to paint the house and seal the rooms to get rid of those disgusting bugs. It was very lonely in the new home. Neighbors were a half mile, a mile, or even more away, and only a few families lived in this little neighborhood. Our nearest market was 4 miles over a hilly, rough road to Des Arc, an all-day journey by wagon. The farm did have one advantage. It was some relief on Mary, as she no longer had to be hospitable to my many patrons at the blacksmith shop or the many friends I had as a preacher. Personally, I would have rather gone without dinner. In the fall, when harvesting time came, the greatest event was making molasses. My sons, Eli and Millard, with the help of Charlie to drive the horse, started grinding the cane before daylight. A fire was built under the vat, and the juice started cooking by 8 o'clock. When the finished product was finally drained into 1-gallon tin buckets, it was more delicious than honey. I sold it to the neighboring farmers for 50 cents a gallon. Most of the children started school at 6 years of age. The school building was about 2 miles from our home. The schools were called subscription schools because the pupils were subscribed at $1 a month per pupil. The term was usually 4 months, or when the money ran out. Usually, a new teacher was employed each year. You didn't have to have a college education to teach. Teachers could get a certificate to teach right out of grade school. The schools did not provide books, so I bought the kids' books at Graves and Stamp Store in Des Arc. There was no structured grading system, but rather went by books. They went to school until they mastered the book, however long it took. One year, a young teacher was hired. I think it was his first school. His name was Jim Wilkinson, and he had an adopted sister named Mabel. They lived in the Peachtree Fork neighborhood, and were neighbors of our church, where I was still preaching from time to time. We were only 3 miles from Peachtree Fork. This is where Eli met Mabel Wilkinson, and they married some years later.
And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick.
On December 27th of 1902, my wife gave birth to her 13th and last baby. In the fall, before Mary gave birth, my son Fred had been badly burned. He didn't like to sleep in a gown, always wanting to leave his little pants on, so Mary made him a pretty little nightgown. It was early morning, and as little Fred stood directly in front of the king heater with all the drafts open, his gown became ignited. He started to scream, and I ran to him, smothering out the fire, but Freddie was badly burned. For 2 months, Mary nursed him and bandaged his terrible sore sides. I can still hear his moans and cries as he suffered so terribly. This was bad for my wife and her condition. When our baby came, it lived only a minute. It was a girl and weighed 14 pounds, but had blue scars on her face. Some people said that the baby was marked by the burns of her little brother. I took the little casket to the Patterson City Cemetery, and on a cold and wintry December day, buried her. My wife would not have named this baby, so I gave her the name of Merle Kathleen, the 13th child in our family. I rode the train often to visit family and preach. Different members of my family had also rode the train now and then. In fact, the best way to get from our place to Piedmont was by train. I will never forget the time when I was coming back from Marine, Illinois. I went to the restroom. As I was leaving, the restroom door locked, jammed, making it impossible for me to get out. No matter how loud I yelled and how hard I beat on the door, no one heard me above the noise of the train. Just as I was wondering what to do next, the train switched onto the side track and stopped to let another train pass. I quickly took advantage of this. I crawled out the window and climbed onto the platform between the coaches and made my way back to my seat. When the conductor came along, he knocked on the restroom door. As no one responded to his knocks, he tried to open the door, but found the door locked. He kept on knocking, but no one answered. He finally took out his key and opened the door, fully expecting some kind of emergency. Much to his surprise, he found no one inside. I will never forget the puzzled look on his face as he walked right by me.
This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it.
Though we certainly were not rich, I made plans for my son William and 2 of my daughters, Ruth and Estella, to go to the World's Fair in St. Louis. It was the middle of August when I put them on a train in Des Arcs. Ruth and Estella had never been on a train before and had never been to such a large city. They couldn't contain their excitement. I had a second cousin named Pearl Backman who lived in St. Louis. She had 2 daughters and a son who had visited us at the farm. So my kids stayed with my cousin for 3 days while at the fair. Since Marine, Illinois was only 30 miles from St. Louis, and I still had a number of relatives living there, my kids also wanted to go see where the old Brooks homestead was and spend some time with their cousins. My youngest brother, Donley, still lived on that old farm. Donley remodeled the house in 1900 by making it a full 2-story. The kids found it to be very interesting to be able to see the place where I grew up. I also had 2 sisters living in Marine, both married now. my older sister Susan Williamson, and my younger sister, Maggie Tabor. Maggie was a widow and had one son named George, after his father. I also had another younger brother who lived and worked on a farm in Marine, Illinois. Millard and his wife, Mary Jane. They had no children of their own, but did have 2 adopted children. Before they left Marine, Estella started feeling sick, and Ruth was very worried about her. They had no more than gotten home when Estella came down with a chill and typhoid fever developed. The fever lingered for 5 weeks, and she had to miss the first month of school. In October, my son Eli and I also went to the St. Louis World's Fair for 4 days. It was in the late evening when we arrived at the fair. There were a million lights with streetcar noise and horses clop clop. There were no autos to speak of back home. It was too wonderful for words, and yet there was fear, for how were we ever to emerge out of such an immense crowd alive? The Ferris wheel I'll never forget. It was 250 feet high and held over 1,000 in a single ride. At the top, they stopped a few minutes to let you see far out over the city, and it was a wonderful view. Then we went on the scenic railway, which was a small train of cars that steered themselves. They went down at terrific speed for what seemed like 100 feet or more, and through caverns and tunnels all lit up. My oldest son, William, had many friends as he was growing up.
A neighbor of ours, Ada Klein, attended the same school as William. They seemed to be inseparable. He would often give her a ride home from school on his horse. William and Ada Jane Klein got married in Greenville, Missouri in 1905. 2 years later, William and his wife, Ada Jane, had a baby, Clyde William. My daughter, Ruth, who had never married, was staying with William and his wife to help with the new baby boy.
I sold the Patterson blacksmith shop to William and his partner Dick Croy. They changed the name of the shop from I.L. Brooks & Company to Brooks & Croy Blacksmith Shop. Dick also bought the home at Patterson, as he had married a few years before. William and Dick Croy remained in partnership working at the blacksmith shop until 1912, when William sold his interest to Dick.
As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
I consider myself a pretty good farmer, but this farmland was rocky and poor and very unproductive. My eyes were now well, so I bought another blacksmith shop and a grist mill at Brunot and decided to go back to work. There was also a home next to the shop for sale at Brunot, so Mary and I left the farm on Camp Creek in the fall of 1909. It was a beautiful fall day when 6 wagons with sideboards on the wagon beds began to gather at our front gate for us to load our belongings onto. It was only about 7 miles through the hills and across the creeks to Brunot, but the roads were rough, and it took the greater part of the day. Brunot was a big place. There were 2 stores, 2 churches, a post office, a doctor's office, and a blacksmith shop. Many log wagons hauled railroad ties to Des Arc, so the blacksmith's business was very good since wagons had to be repaired and horses and mules had to be shod. Ruth and I, we also made caskets. We sometimes worked most of the night by lamplight. The deceased were buried one day after death, and it was not unusual for me to work all night and then ride several miles to preach at the funeral. The original location of the Christian church was located about 2.5 miles north of Brunot, on the east side of the road, leading from Brunot to Ironton, and was constructed of logs. With the growth of the population in the area, the decision was made to relocate the congregation to a new building in Brunot. This building was completed in 1877. Mr. Russell, who helped build the church, said that the building was so structurally sound it could be rolled over and over without damage. Ruth and Virgie, being devout Christians, joined the Brunot Christian Church. Ruth was baptized in 1912. Perhaps the biggest change of all for the kids was school. There were so many pupils, maybe 40 or more, that they had grades or classes. The goal of the students in elementary school was to complete the 8th grade. If the student passed, then they would be eligible for high school. I purchased the property of the Brunot Spring from Mr. and Miss Lee Jackson around 1910. The spring was used by every family living at Brunot. There was at least 6 spring houses or cubicles made of rough lumber that lined the springs. The cool water kept milk, butter, and other foods from spoiling during the summer. It was the refrigeration system. No one locked the door to their spring house because everyone was trusted, even when the contents were watermelon or other cherished food. I always had watermelons cooling in the spring during the summer. When our children's families would all show up, I would bring out a table, set it along the spring, and cut open a cool watermelon for everyone to share. I was told that during the Civil War, Major General Sterling Price of the Southern Army brought his troops and some 2,000 and camped by this spring before traveling north to fight the Battle of Pilot Knob against General I. Ewing. In the evenings, I would read to the family by candlelight. Some of their favorite stories were the Swiss Family Robinsons, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, as well as many other Mark Twain stories. I remember when Mary found out who Mark Twain was. "Sam Clemens!" she exclaimed with surprise.
Why, I've heard Pa speak of him lots of times. Pa knew him well.
Paul Thornburg had been a Mississippi riverboat pilot in his younger days, when Mark Twain had been a caterpillar growing in a common cocoon called Sam Clemens. According to the way Mary remembered it, her father had taught Sam Clemens to pilot.